A lot of people don't understand how deep it is with astrology and the ancients, and that everything that they did was based on astrology. And really, up until the medieval times, everything that the people did, even in England and Europe, was based on astrology. And as I will show you in the upcoming videos, how basically everything is dealing with astrology and based off of that when you really begin to understand. So, this video is no different. But people need to understand the aspects of Osiris as well as these other deities that we know are equated with Osiris and why it all come together and makes sense. So most Christians believe when we talk about Osiris that we basically worship Osiris. When we talk about these Egyptian gods, we basically worship them. We chose to choose Egyptian gods over Jesus Christ and the prophets in the Bible, and that all this stuff is basically, just us accepting Egyptian stuff over biblical stuff when we clearly have proof of the Egyptian stuff and no proof of the biblical stuff. Now, if you watch the videos, of course, you understand now that when we're talking about Osiris, when we're talking about these gods, that they represent different aspects of reality that exists. So with Osiris, he represents many things, as we'll get into in this video. Not just the backbone, not just agriculture, but many spiritual things, as well as the other Egyptian gods. But of course, when we go into Christianity, Jesus is supposed to be a real man that existed. Moses is supposed to be a real man that existed. And a lot of people don't understand the esoteric background behind these characters and what they really represent. Only with the ancient Egyptians and other, ancient cultures, we see that they created these beings, but they did not hide the aspects of which they belong to. They made them to help teach about these aspects and to get people to understand what these things represent. And to better get people to understand is to create stories around them. So if you're not into that understanding, you need to understand that first, before we get into everything. This is going to be a very good, very deep video, and you're going to learn a lot. It's going to connect a lot of dots for you guys. So now we heard the story of Osiris. So we know it's metaphorical. You have, depending on which version of the story that you have heard or read, you have Osiris. We know Set chops him up into 13 pieces. 12 pieces are found. One is not, and that's his penis or the phalanx. And we know that Isis and Nephthys goes out and finds these pieces. And Isis hovers over him as a hawk and makes his penis grow and impregnates herself and gives birth to Horus. And you also have the story where, they go out and find him and he becomes the god of the underworld. Basically, in both stories, you have to understand the whole aspect of god of the underworld and what does that mean. So when we look at Osiris and we look at Osiris in the underworld, this is what we usually see. And this is from the Book of the Dead with Ani. And we see Osiris in the underworld, and we have so many references to Osiris in the underworld. But this depiction here is basically this. And we see this and we see the zodiac. So while we have the representation of Jesus, and we understand Jesus means he represents a few things, Jesus himself alone represents the sun. He represents you as well. So does Osiris represent us and the sun as well. But Osiris alone represents the sun. He also represents all 12 signs of the zodiac. The disciples for Jesus represents the 12 signs of the zodiac. And how Osiris represents the entire zodiac is because he was chopped up in 14 pieces. 13 pieces were found. Those 13 pieces represent the 12 signs of the zodiac, and Osiris being the sun as well, the sun as well. The piece that was missing, of course, represents the phalanx. And of course, the phalanx represents the sun, the obelisk. So when you go back and you look at the obelisk and all the depictions of it and what it represents, it's a representation of the sun. So we know Osiris also represents the Jed. And the death of Osiris is called the fall of Osiris. It represents his fall. Do you think it's a coincidence that when you die, we say, you fall when you die? When a soldier dies, we say we have a fallen soldier. And we also have a season called fall. And what happens during the fall? The leaves basically die, they fall off the tree. So again, we have to understand it's not a play on words and that these words, it means something for a reason. So Osiris representing agriculture and representing growing the crops and nature and everything like that. Uh, this representation of his fall is giving you exactly that understanding of the fall. So this relief right here is called the fall of Osiris or the rising of Osiris. But all it is this. It's the fall equinox or the autumn or autumn equinox. Ra represents the rising sun, Atum the setting sun. Combined, you get Re Atum, who passes through the underworld every night. So when we see the cross of the zodiac, the vertical line represents the rise or fall. The horizontal line represents life and death. Rise is life, fall is death. So underneath this line represents the underworld, which is showing you that Osiris is the god of the underworld. When you see the depiction of Osiris being laid out, it's representing that justice, horizontal line across the zodiac. And he represents the underworld because, again, we're talking about the fall equinox. We're talking about stuff that's happening underneath this equator. So we know that line really is the equator. Things that's happening during this time is what Osiris is representing. And it's simply that. So they show you, and it's all geometry, it's all math, it's science. They're showing you these vertical lines and they're showing you these degrees basically on a circle, which is, masonry when you get into it, but basically to represent the zodiac itself, which, as I said, is really the key to everything when you understand the zodiac. So this depiction, again, is representing the rise or fall of Osiris, depending on where you want to place it at. And below that line is the underworld. So Osiris is the god of life, death, resurrection, vegetation, agriculture, etc. Represents us, he represents the sun, and many other things. So the raising and lowering of the Jed is basically talking about the Corex festival, which I talked about before. When you understand during the Corex festival, you have that little man, which is Osiris, is in the shape of Osiris, and you see the wheat and barley growing from him. So when you look at the depiction, you can see that he's laying horizontally. So when you're in your coffin, when you're dead and gone, you lay horizontally. You lay flat on your back, or that's basically the death position. And we see it with our arms crossed and us laying flat on our back. So that Osiris laying horizontally symbolizes life during the Corex festival. The wheat and barley that's growing up is symbolizing resurrection or life from the underworld. It symbolizes rebirth or growth. So Isis, when she's growing the penis of Osiris, you basically have Osiris giving birth to himself, when you understand. So what does that sound like? When you look at the depiction, you see he's basically impregnating Isis to give birth to himself. It's the same thing as Jesus. Osiris is a god. He gives birth to himself, who he is the same as Horus, which is why Horus kills Set, because it's basically Osiris giving birth to himself through Isis. So he is also the father and he's also the son, you understand. So it's the same representation with Jesus. You have God impregnating Mary and giving birth to himself. And this is one of the reasons why the story is all confused. And some people don't want to say, well, Jesus is not God and so on and so forth. So they can throw shade on the fact that it equals with the Egyptian story of Osiris. Because Osiris is basically giving birth to himself, just like with Jesus. So basically, this right here is the same as this. Take a look at it. I know it's going to blow people's mind, but it's the same exact thing. You have Jesus representing the Son. You have the 12 disciples. The same thing with Osiris, who he himself represents the Son, and also the 12 signs of the zodiac, just like the disciples represent the 12 signs of the zodiac. So you got to start putting this stuff together and understand we're talking about the same stuff. And as we go on, you're going to see what other deities is getting into the same exact thing that's going back to one understanding. We're talking about stars, we're talking about the universe. So you have autumn, which is basically fall, starting September 22nd and ends December 21st, which is the start of the winter solstice, as we all know. And then we know the whole story with Jesus Christ and the whole thing with that and what that entails is the same stuff. So you have the rising and lowering of the Jed, which deals with the solstice and equinox. So now the solstice is when the sun is basically the furthest away from the equator during Earth's rotation. And you have the equinox, which is basically when it's at its closest distance from the equator. So Isis rising and lowering the Jed and Mary holding Jesus is all symbolic. It's talking about the precession of the equinox and the solstice. So when we look at the depictions, they are the same, talking about the same thing, both representing the sun. So now we know Osiris represents many things. So when we look at this depiction of the Last Supper, these 12 disciples don't only represent the 12 signs of the zodiac. They don't also just represent, the seasons. They also represent planets and constellations. And when you look at this and you compare it to the Ani's Book of the Dead with Osiris, as I said, it's the same. But this becomes this. So as I said, you are the sun. Jesus and Osiris represents the sun. So when we're talking about the underworld, when it's talking about judgment, it's simply talking about the sun's journey through the constellations, which is our journey through the constellations. That's all it's talking about. When it's talking about Osiris being the god of the underworld, the sun is taking that journey to the underworld, plain and simple. So we're talking about, as I said, that horizontal line, which is basically, you have to look at it as a zodiac, a circle, and understand that below that line during this time frame, which would be the winter solstice, is the sun, going through that period. But the sun also making its entire journey through all the constellations is what it's representing when it's talking about Osiris. So in the book of Revelations, Jesus says, I'm the Alpha and Omega, the beginning and end. And we know that Osiris is also referred to as the Alpha and Omega, the beginning and end. That's what these represent. So just like God is Jesus, Osiris is Horus. So you have God basically giving birth to Jesus, or having Mary give birth to Jesus with no penis. The same symbolic thing with Osiris and Isis. There was no penis. It's symbolic. And it's the same exact thing when you really look at it. So get that understanding. Same thing. Same beings we're talking about, same situation with the sun, same thing with the zodiac. It all makes sense when you begin to understand and look into everything. So remember the Sphinx. And we're talking about Alpha, Omega, beginning, and end. The Sphinx represents the beginning, if you remember. So the Sphinx represents Leo, which Leo faced, the Sphinx faced Leo between 10 and 30,000 years ago, which we know the Egyptians called the Septepi, or the first time. So when the moon is in Leo, it marks the beginning of a cycle, a monthly cycle. When the moon is in Cancer, it marks the end of a cycle. So the moon in Leo represents the right eye of Horus. When it's in Cancer, the left eye, which is basically the Alpha and Omega. But it's much deeper than this, as I'm going to break down right here. But first, understand, as we know, Jesus in the end of Revelations, Revelations 22:16, he says, I am the bright and morning star. Osiris is also referred to as the bright and morning star. We know Lucifer, Satan, is referred to as the bright and morning star, but we know the bright and morning star is Venus. And in the Bible, in the NIV, they made sure that they put that Lucifer as the bright and morning star. And as I said, we know Venus represents the bright and morning star, but a lot of people had no clue that Jupiter is also referred to as the bright and morning star. Now, again, all this stuff is going to come together in a second, but my main goal is to get you guys to understand that these things that we're talking about, as I alluded to in the beginning, when we're getting into Osiris, these main guys are all talking about the same thing. When we get into Jesus, when we get into God, when we get into Horus and Osiris, we're talking about the same exact stuff. And that everything that we're talking about, the main deities, the main topic of all these so-called religions, is going back to astrology, the planets, and the constellations, which is everything still today and was everything back in the ancient world. Now, as I said, many people have no clue as Jupiter being the bright and morning star. Now, it says in Job 38:7, it says, when the morning stars sang together and all the children of God shouted for joy, implying what? That there's more than one morning star. Now, Jupiter would naturally not be looked at because, it's the biggest planet, it's the big dog. So people not look into it as, the bright and morning star. It's like, okay, well, if Jupiter was this bright star, you would think we would see it much more than Venus, since it's, small. You got to understand the importance of Jupiter. Albert Pike said this: his power was symbolized by an eye over a scepter. The sun was termed by the Greeks the eye of Jupiter and the eye of the world, and his is the all-seeing eye in our lodges. And Osiris was invoked as the god that resides in the sun and is enveloped by his rays, the invisible and eternal force that modifies the sublunary world by means of the sun. Let's just go back to Greek mythology, where you have the Greeks using the planets and basically identifying them as gods, as I talked about before. So you have Jupiter being this, all-powerful god, which would be the Roman equivalent to basically Kronos or Saturn or God or Zeus. When you start breaking all this stuff down, it's talking about the same thing. You have the Greek version, you have the Roman version, and you go back to ancient Kemet, it's talking about the same stuff. And it's one of the reasons why I said before, when the Romans conquered the Greeks, why did they continue Hellenization? Why did they continue these customs? They just changed the names.